Hi, third graders. Welcome back to our reading of Fantastic Mr. Fox. Yesterday, you got to read chapters 3 and 4 with Miss Walsh, and today we're going to continue and read chapters 5 and 6. Yesterday, you worked on talking about problem and solution, and you talked about some of the different plans that the farmers had in order to capture the fox. But unfortunately, the plans so far have both failed. First, they tried to wait outside of the Fox family hole, but Mr. Fox caught on to this and the family did not leave the hole, so that plan failed. Then the farmers tried to dig into the hole, but the Fox family dug deep into their hole to get away. Remember, foxes can dig very, very fast. And at the end of chapter 4, Mr. Fox thinks that they have done it and that they have gotten away. Today we're going to focus on a couple things, but before we start reading, I want you to take a second and think to yourself. So you can stop the video at this time and answer this question to yourself. How on earth will the farmers ever capture the fox if digging isn't working? Once you've thought about your answer, you can continue the video. That question was just there to get your mind ready to go. There's not really a right or wrong answer, but just think to yourself, if we know that the farmers can't dig fast enough, how are they ever going to get to the foxes? And today our big question is going to be, how has the farmer's plan to capture Mr. Fox changed over the first several chapters? Because sometimes plans change, and we're going to talk about the progression of their plan over the first several chapters. Before we start reading, we're going to talk about some key vocabulary words that we're going to see in our story today. The first word is keen, and when you are keen, that means that you're very eager or you're very enthusiastic. The next word is obstinate. That means that you're refusing to change your mind, even if others are trying to persuade you. And the last word is determined. It means that you make a decision and you stick with it no matter what. So we're going to get started reading chapter 5. Please feel free to read along with me as I read out loud. Chapter 5, The Terrible Tractors. As the sun rose the next morning, Bogus and Bunce and Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could have put a house into it, but they had not yet come to the end of the fox's tunnel. They were all very tired and cross. "Dang and blast," said Bogus. "Whose rotten idea was this?" "Bean's idea," said Bunce. Bogus and Bunce both stared at Bean. Bean took another swig of cider, then put the flask back into his pocket without offering it to the others. "Listen," he said angrily, "I want that fox. I'm going to get that fox. I am not giving in till I've strung him up over my front porch dead as a dumpling." "We can't get him by digging, that's for sure," said the fat Bogus. "I've had enough of digging." Bunce, the little pot-bellied dwarf, looked up at Bean and said, "Have you got any more stupid ideas then?" "What?" said Bean. "I can't hear you." Bean never took a bath. He never even washed. As a result, his ear holes were clogged with all kinds of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. This made him deaf. "Speak louder," he said to Bunce, and Bunce shouted back, "Got any more stupid ideas?" Bean rubbed the back of his neck with a dirty finger. He had a boil coming there, and it itched. "What we need on this job," he said, "is machines. Mechanical shovels. We'll have him out in 5 minutes with mechanical shovels." This was a pretty good idea, and the other two had to admit it. "All right then," Bean said, taking charge. "Bogus, you stay here and see the fox doesn't escape. Bunce and I will go and fetch our machines. If he tries to get out, shoot him quick." Good readers always fix their mistakes if they make a mistake. The long, thin Bean walked away. The tiny Buns trotted after him. The Fat Bog stayed where he was, with his gun pointing to the foxhole. Soon, two enormous caterpillar tractors with mechanical shovels on their front ends came clanking into the wood. Bean was driving one, Bunce the other. The machines were both black. They were murderous, brutal-looking monsters. "Here we go, then," shouted Bean. "Death to the fox," shouted Bunce. The machines went to work, biting huge mouthfuls of soil out of the hill. The big tree under which Mr. Fox had dug his hole in the first place was toppled like a matchstick. On all sides, rocks were sent flying and trees were falling, and the noise was deafening. Down in the tunnel, the foxes crouched, listening to the terrible clanging and banging overhead. "What's happening, Dad?" cried the small foxes. "What are they doing?" Mr. Fox didn't know what was happening or what they were doing. "It's an earthquake!" cried Mrs. Fox. "Look," said one of the small foxes, "our tunnel is getting shorter, and I can see daylight." They all looked around, and yes, the mouth of the tunnel was only a few feet away from them now. And in the circle of daylight beyond, they could see the two huge black tractors almost on top of them. "Tractors!" shouted Mr. Fox, "and mechanical shovels! Dig for your lives! Dig, dig, dig!" So take a second and stop and think to yourself right now, how do you think the foxes are feeling? And how can you tell? So remember, something that good readers do is they use evidence from the text. So if I'm thinking how the foxes feel and I go back to the text, I know that it said that the little foxes cried as they asked what was happening. When I think of the little foxes crying, that tells me that they're probably feeling scared hearing all of these noises or worried. And I also know that they start to see the hole getting smaller, which means that they know that the farmers are getting closer to them, so that's probably also making them feel really worried and anxious. And then even the last sentence, when Mr. Fox says, "dig for your lives," you can tell that they're super, super worried. So what I did is I answered my question by going back to the text to find evidence. Chapter 6. The title of this chapter is The Race. Now there began a desperate race, the machines against the foxes. In the beginning, the hill looked like this. After about an hour, as the machines bit away more and more soil from the hilltop, it looked like this. So notice the picture here and the picture on the slide before. The hill is starting to get smaller and smaller. Sometimes the foxes would gain a little ground, and the clanking noise would grow fainter, and Mr. Fox would say, "We're gonna make it! I'm sure we are." But then, a few moments later, the machine would come back at them, and the crunch of the mighty shovel would get louder and louder. Once the foxes actually saw the sharp metal edge of one of the shovels as it scraped up the earth just behind them. "Keep going, my darlings," panted Mr. Fox. "Don't give up. Keep going." The Fat Boggus shouted to Bunce and Bean. "We'll get him any moment now." "Have you caught sight of him yet?" Bean called back. "Not yet," shouted Boggus, "but I think we're close." "I'll pick him up with my bucket," shouted Bunce. "I'll chop him to pieces." But by lunchtime, the machines were still at it, and so were the poor foxes. The hill now looked like this. The farmers didn't stop for lunch. They were too keen to finish the job. "Hey there, Mr. Fox," yelled Bunce, leaning out of the tractor. "We're coming to get you now." "You've had your last chicken," yelled Boggus. "You'll never come prowling around my farm again." a sort of madness had taken hold of the three men. The tall, skinny Bean and the dwarfish, pot-bellied Bunce were driving their machines like maniacs, racing the motors and making the shovels dig at a terrific speed. The fat Bogus was hopping about like a dervish and shouting, "Faster, faster!" By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is what had happened to the hill. Think about how the hill looked when we first started this chapter. Now look at that picture. The hole the machine had dug was like the crater of a volcano. It was such an extraordinary sight that crowds of people came rushing out from the surrounding villages to have a look. They stood on the edge of the crater and stared down at Bogus and Bunce and Bean. "Hey there, Bogus, what's going on?" "We're after a fox." "You must be mad." The people jeered and laughed, but this only made the three farmers more furious and more obstinate and more determined than ever to not give up until they had caught the fox. So that is the end of chapter 6. Now I want you to think back to the question that I posed in the beginning. I asked you how the farmers plan to capture the fox has changed. So take a moment, pause the video, and think to yourself, how has the farmers' plan to capture the fox changed? So we know earlier in our earlier chapters that the farmers tried to wait outside the fox's hole, but that didn't work, so they had to change their plan again. We know that the farmers tried to dig with just shovels, and we know that didn't work, so they had to change their plan again. Then in this past chapter, chapter 5 and 6, they actually got mechanical shovels, and they started digging and digging and digging. And we can tell by looking at the pictures that they're starting to get really, really close to the foxes, and that is making them very determined to reach the foxes. So we're going to have to read tomorrow to find out if they end up reaching the foxes. What I would like you to do right now is, you see over on the right-hand side, it says in the comments, do you think the title of this chapter, The Race, is a good title? Why or why not? So you're going to write a sentence in the comments telling me why the title of this chapter, The Race, is a good title for this chapter. All right, we'll see you tomorrow to continue reading.